Welcome to INSEAD's lifelong learning event. My name is Svenja Weber. I'm a professor here at INSEAD, and it's my great pleasure to be speaking to Gary Hamel today about his latest work and his book on humanocracy. Gary Hamel is described by Forbes magazine as the world's leading expert in business strategy, and the Financial Times calls him a management innovator without peer. He has written numerous articles, and his many books have been translated into 25 languages. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to INSEAD, Gary, today.
Thank you so much, Sonia. It's a great honor to have the chance to chat with you.
Great. Gary, tell us, your previous work has focused a lot more on strategy and business strategy. This book is different. Why this shift in focus?
Well, yeah, let me give you just a little bit of background. You know, Svenja, I spend most of my life working with large organizations around the world. That's outside of my academic career, but often working with them to make them more innovative or to help them with some, major revectoring, major change. And as I did that work, and I have to say it was often successful, but we'd create a project, we'd take people offline, we'd train them how to think like business innovators, we'd get some of the internal structures and systems out of the way, we'd turn on that innovation capacity and create new businesses and new products, and often with quite spectacular results. But I'd come back a year or two later, and most of that work, even though you could see kind of, the economic impact, nothing had changed in the culture. Innovation still wasn't a natural instinct. They were still stuck in many ways. And so, when you see this over and over again across many organizations, across cultures, across industries, it started to occur to me that whatever our organizations were built to do, they were not built to change, and they were not built to innovate, and they were not built to really turn on the imagination and the initiative of the people inside of them. So I kind of think of these as the core incompetencies of the corporation, that so often large organizations, they're inertial, they struggle with kind of a change. In fact, if you look at almost every change program in a large company, it's a catch-up program. They're often years behind some external shift, and now they're rushing to catch up. They're incremental. They struggle with game-changing innovation, and as we'll see when we look at a little bit of the data, they're also dispiriting. They use so little of that potential human capacity. So when you see, Svenja, when you see those disabilities over and over again, you realize this is not about a particular organization. There's something much deeper going on. So what I got curious about was, all right, if our organizations weren't built to be adaptable and innovative and engaging, what were they built to do? So you go back in management history and you look at kind of the beginning of modern industrial management in the late 19th century, and you understand that what our organizations were built to do was to achieve efficiency at scale, to do the same things over and over again with perfect replicability and ever increasing efficiency. And we succeeded at that. The fact that a billion people in the year can have a billion people on the planet can have an automobile, the amount of material goods we have is all testament to this immense success. And if you look over the last 150 years at the growth in capital and labor productivity, it's impressive. And yet, you realize that that our organizations are built on that 19th century technology, that the management model you find in most organizations still has its root in 19th century industrial management. And that was a time when the average employee was illiterate, not just poorly educated, but illiterate. It was a time when information was very difficult and expensive to move. So the best way of doing that was to have 10 people report up to a manager who would consolidate their data and then push that further up the chain of command. And so literally only the people at the top had the full picture. It was a time when administrative skills were rare. The first business school, Wharton, gets established in the late 19th century, Harvard and others early in the 20th century. But 100 years ago, administrative skills were as rare as being maybe a geneticist or a data scientist today. It was a time when scale was the paramount advantage and where change was relatively glacial. Well, none of those things are true anymore, not even one of them. And yet our organizations are still firmly rooted in that kind of 19th century way of thinking. And so having spent several decades thinking about a business model innovation and writing a book, Leading the Revolution, a couple of decades ago, arguing that leaders had to be able to imagine radically different business models, it became clearer and clearer to me that the ultimate constraint on organizational performance wasn't the business model, it wasn't the operating model, it was the management model. And so that's over the last decade or so, that's really where my attention has gone. And the new book is really a way of bringing all of that thinking, all that work to kind of a conclusion and trying to lay out not only what that alternative to that industrial management model may be, but kind of how do you get there? But that's the genesis of saying, how do we finally get over these fundamental disabilities that have afflicted our organizations for a century and more?
Yeah, great. So Gary, I mean, one of the things I think that surprised me most in the data that you present in the book is that that bureaucracy is not in decline at all, despite all the things you've just mentioned. How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, Svenja, to recognize that, bureaucracy was built to solve a set of problems, and they're definitely worthwhile problems to solve. So it was built essentially to help us get control of things, so we could do the same things over and over again with perfect replicability. It was designed to ensure consistency over time and coordination of complex activities. So that's really what that old management model bureaucracy gave us was control, coordination, and consistency. And those are still very important organizational virtues. They're just not as important as they used to be. And so one of the questions that I asked was, could we buy those organizational capabilities? Could we buy control and coordination and consistency kind of like duty free without all the side effects? As I said, the inertia, the incrementalism, the disengagement that you find in our organizations. But yes, the question, it's a great question. Why has this persisted so long? And I think there are a couple of reasons there. One is persistent because it's worked. It's done very well at what it was designed to do. And we're a little bit reluctant to mess with that and screw that up. Secondly, I think it's been persistent because many leaders, many managers, I will say many professors have never seen an alternative. They just assume there's one. I mean, every organization they've gone inside of, in every single one, they see the same kind of a bureaucratic model, right? They see an organization in which power trickles down, in which big leaders appoint little leaders, in which resources are allocated at the top, strategy gets set at the top, managers assign tasks and assess performance, employees compete for the scarce resource of a promotion, compensation correlates with rank. And so if virtually every organization you've ever seen fits that template, it's kind of hard. It's like when the Iberian explorers, when the Spanish and Portuguese first came to the New World in the 15th and 16th century, Native Americans had not yet invented the wheel, right? I mean, they just never. And so I'm sure the first time they saw the wheel, they were like, "Are you kidding me? Like we've been dragging our crap all this time? Wow, like that's cool." But I think that would be the second. So first is it works. Second, it's immensely familiar. But I think the third point, Svenja, is that despite the fact that you won't find a single leader probably in the world that will claim to be a fan of bureaucracy, the fact is bureaucracy works pretty well for the bureaucratic class, right? If you've spent your career learning how to accumulate positional power, if you've developed all the skills you need to be a good bureaucrat, if you've learned how to hoard resources, negotiate targets, manage up, deflect blame, that's a familiar game. And in fact, I describe bureaucracy as a massive multiplayer game that's played for the stakes of positional power. And if you've gotten, really, really good at that game, you're not so keen on, giving it up. And so I think that would probably be the third reason it's been so persistent. Maybe just one or two last reasons that it's so deeply entrenched and so persistent. One is that bureaucracy is kind of self-perpetuating. If you look at what happens, I live in the middle of Silicon Valley. In fact, let me see if I can pull up a few slides here and we'll try this. But I live in Silicon Valley and I see all these young dynamic companies that get created and they have a new business model and it's exciting to watch them develop and grow. And if you look at those young companies, really the advantage they have is less the business model. New business ideas are not that rare. What they often has is an organizational innovation, right? There are few layers, roles are very flexible, communication is relatively easy, everybody's on the same page, everyone is passionate about creating something new, they all feel like they report to the customer. So you have these young organizations, I say, bold, simple, lean, open, flat, and free. And yet as they grow and they start to get more complexity, more size, they start to hire managers from traditional companies. They start to talk to the usual consultants. And pretty soon you can just watch how all of those bureaucratic I'll come back to this in a minute, but you can just watch on how this the wet cement of bureaucracy starts to set. And once so you reach a point in the growth of any organization where bureaucracy starts to grow faster than the organization itself, and it will never reverse itself. Just think about one of the dynamics. Today, anytime an organization faces a new challenge, it creates a new CXO. So now we have chief diversity officer, chief experience officer, chief marketing officer, chief technical officer, chief compliance officer, and every one of those individuals builds their own fiefdom. The way they demonstrate their value and power is more policies, more procedures. They want more data. And so, so you see these young, vibrant organizations, and as they grow, they just lose that. And at some point, they have all these not very attractive characteristics. So bureaucracy is in many ways self-perpetuating. And let me see if I can pull up one little bit of data on that, because I too, Svenja, I was kind of surprised when we started to look at the numbers on this. And well, let me just describe the case in the United States. We've looked at this in the UK, in Germany, not every country, but I think it's a typical pattern. In the US, if you go back to 1983, so whatever that is now, almost 40 years ago, if you look at the growth of administrators and managers and supervisors and support staff, we took IT out, but HR, finance is in there. If you look at the growth of administrators, supervisors, support staff, well, I'll call it the bureaucratic class. Since 1983, that group of employees has more than doubled. It's grown more than 100%, more than double. All other categories of jobs have grown less than 50%. So bureaucracy is growing far faster than the workforce overall, far faster than the economy overall. And we did our best to control for increased regulation. And most of the growth that you see in bureaucracy is not coming from government demands for more compliance, more regulation. It is the internal self-propagating tendencies of bureaucracy. Let me throw out one last thing that I think is somewhat responsible for this continued growth. We live in a world that's obviously become much more complex and much more volatile. And historically, if being a manager or being a CEO, if that meant anything, it meant being in control. And so now I have a world where everything seems out of control, where there's so many things that are changing. And I think, and this is perhaps more speculative on my part, but I sense it's true. And when I test it with executives, they tell me it's true. I think, what you see in these organizations is power over the years. Power is moving towards the center. The amount of discretion that frontline employees have is going down. So there's more and more focus on exerting control, on trying to make sure everyone is doing the same thing in the same way across the world, across the organization. And I think part of that ratchet of centralization, that ratchet of standardization has come because CEOs are trying to fit the complexity of the world into their own cognitive capabilities. And one way of doing that is by ensuring uniformity. So when I go to bed at night, I know we have a policy for everything. I know everybody's doing, now it's an illusion to believe that creates control. But I think a lot of CEOs are they're trying to fit the complexity of the world so somehow it can be contained in their own cognitive limits. And so that explains, I think, a lot of the centralization, the standardization. Let me give you one example. I was talking a few weeks ago to a friend, Jim Hagemann-Schnabe. Jim is the non-executive chairman of Maersk, the biggest shipping company in the world, also Siemens. And before that, he was the co-CEO of SAP. And he said that when he left SAP, they had 5,000 KPIs. 5,000 different performance targets across the company for every role, every job. And he wasn't bragging. He was kind of embarrassed about this. And he was saying, we thought that if we could just disaggregate success into this mass of targets, and we could give everybody a specific target, somehow that would re-aggregate back up into performance, except it doesn't. Because when you live in an immensely volatile world, the only way you build an adaptive organization is pushing power down. But that's a very counterintuitive thing for a lot of leaders who are very anxious to believe that somehow every base is covered, we're in control, and therefore we can go to the shareholders and we can go to bed at night believing that this organization will work as we hope it works. So I think that's another reason this has just been so persistent.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Gary. I mean, lots of questions coming through also here, but let's I mean, you talk about the unicorns, and at some point they're moving towards more bureaucratic structures. Is there a threshold that you see? Is it the size, or what makes that flip?
Yeah, I think there is a threshold, Svenja, and I think it comes, certainly by the time you get to 1,000 employees, you've crossed that threshold. Certainly by the time you get to a few $100 million in revenue, you've crossed that threshold. You do not have to be a particularly big enterprise to suffer from these problems. As I said, it becomes kind of irreversible. Now, one thing that a lot of people have hoped for and have counted on is, okay, yes, we have these big incumbent companies. They're slow, they're bureaucratic. But we can count on all these upstarts, right? We can count on these entrepreneurial companies. They will hold the old guard to account, and if the old guard doesn't change and adapt, well then, the new guard will take over. I will say that's mostly a false hope, partly because as those young companies grow, they become bureaucratic themselves. But again, let me see if I can share a little bit of data that I skipped over for a moment, Svenja. So this is, right now, if you look across the globe, there are about almost 600 unicorns, roughly $1.9 trillion of market value. These are privately held, venture-funded, privately held companies, each with a market value of more than $1 billion. Now you can see the distribution around the world of the total number of unicorns. China 32, US 54, EU 4%. And so let me give you the data here. If you look right now across the EU, this is non-UK, just the rest of the EU. The EU unicorns are about $85 billion of market value. That is less than 1% of the value of the 350 largest companies in Europe. Right? Entrepreneurship is pretty much irrelevant in Europe. And by the way, in the US, it's only 3%. Right? The US has a little more entrepreneurship, but it's not like, and so I didn't talk about this data earlier, but what we know, Svenja, what we know is that productivity growth is coming down in most developed countries. It's about half what it was 20 years ago. Lower productivity growth means we are going to struggle to solve our biggest problems. We're going to struggle to find the money for healthcare, for climate change, and so on. Lower productivity growth means more income inequality. And so we have lower productivity growth across the OECD. We have less business dynamism than we had 20 or 30 years ago. And so I would argue, and one of the reasons I'm quite passionate about this topic is, there is no way to build a vibrant economy. There's no way to create more good jobs unless we infuse every organization with the spirit of entrepreneurship. We can't simply hope that we have a few entrepreneurial firms here and there. We have to take every company of every size and make every single job in that organization more entrepreneurial at its core. That's the only way, we're going to solve the kind of economic stasis that you see in so many countries around the world. So yeah, this is a big challenge.
Yes. So what's the alternative then, Gary? What should we be aiming for, and where should we be moving towards?
Well, let me see if I can give a couple of examples, Svenja, because again, this is so familiar. Many people have a hard time imagining an alternative. Let me give two, and I'll because we're so short on time, I'll just take a couple of minutes on each one. And people can go much deeper in the book if they want to go. So let me start with a European company. This is the largest provider of home health care in the Netherlands, Birdsorg. The company is about 15, 16 years old. It was started by a nurse, Jos de Blok, and he started the company, he said, because he wanted to put humanity over bureaucracy. And he saw how bureaucratic healthcare had become in the Netherlands. There were protocols and rules for every possible kind of patient service. You were paid against those very specific services. That meant there was no continuity in care. It was very expensive for the Dutch government. And he had a vision of delivering a home healthcare. This is for people recovering from surgery, for dementia, others, but delivering this in a fundamentally different way. So today, Birdsorg is a company with about 16,000 employees, about 12,000 of them are nurses. Those 16,000 employees are divided into 12-person teams that serve a particular geographic location. Each of those teams runs like an independent business. Each team is responsible for finding office space, for hiring nurses, for doing continuing education, for finding patients and building relationships with the community. And so they are immensely entrepreneurial. Those teams do most of the work of managing. Within that 12-person team, one nurse will be responsible for HR issues. One will be responsible for finance. One will be responsible for continuing education. So they've taken the work of managing and they've distributed it within those teams. Now, each of those nurses spends most of the day, with patients, but they also have a managerial role as well. And they're trained to play that managerial role. So all of these teams are then connected together through an online platform called WeLink. So if I have a question with a particular patient or something I can't solve locally, I can put that question up online. I can interrogate the wisdom of 16,000 colleagues almost instantly. All of those things are tagged, so you can go in and see if this question has been asked before. So at Birdsorg, there are almost no top-down controls. There are no top-down protocols. Nobody tells you how to do your job. Now, there are clear metrics for every team. Every team, they can see number of hours that they're billing out. They can see patient satisfaction data. So every team knows exactly how they're doing, and they can compare against more than 1,000 other teams. So there's no place for mediocrity to hide. So you have an organization where the work of managing is happening right on the front lines, where coordination happens not through policy and protocol and additional layers. Coordination happens through collaboration and transparency. And what's really crazy, Svenja, is you have this company that beats its peers on every single measure of performance by a big margin. And it's a company that has about 50 on-demand coaches. So if there's something you really can't solve, you can find a coach. They have about 50 people working in IT, building the platform and maintaining that. And they have two executives. They have one director, one assistant director, no other managers. So this is a span of control of one manager to 8,000 employees in a highly regulated, industry delivering a vital human service. So when you see this, Svenja, you can't unsee it. You go and I can tell you, there is no logic in the world today for an organization of any size to have more than 3 layers. None whatsoever. I'll give you another example. Hire in China. I've been a chief transformation officer there for a few years. I've studied them for a long time. The largest and most profitable appliance maker in the world. And when Hire moved to this new model, they got rid of 12,000 middle managers. And those jobs will never come back. Now, they didn't fire those people. They divided the company into 4,000 micro enterprises. And so you might have a micro enterprise with 15 people that builds and sells 3-door refrigerators, let's say. So those 12,000 middle managers got reassigned into these small entrepreneurial units. Every one of those little units is guaranteed 3 freedoms. The freedom to set their own strategy, the freedom to hire and organize as they see fit, and the freedom to set rewards. Every employee, you can invest in your own micro enterprise in a capital account. And when you do well, you can get a substantial dividend out of that. So they've said, we want every single employee to feel like an entrepreneur. They've also taken all of their internal functions, HR, finance, and so on. They've also divided those into these micro enterprises. You know, in many large companies, the majority of employees are not really customer facing, and their compensation isn't at risk depending on how they do with customers. What Hires said was, we want zero distance between every employee and their customers. So let's say let's say you're this little product business and you need some help from HR. You want to hire some new talent. You'll go to HR or a little HR micro enterprise. You'll write a contract. Help me hire some people. That contract will have a performance clause in it where a substantial part of what you pay that little HR business depends on the success of your products in the marketplace. So the CEO of Hire, Zhang Rumin, he says, and he's only exaggerating a little bit, he says today, Hire doesn't pay any of its employees. The customers pay our employees. And if you do not deliver a service to either internal or external customers they want, you can go out of business. You know, why shouldn't that be the case in every organization? That every employee is customer facing. Every employee has some of their compensation at risk on doing the right thing for customers, because today, customers can vote you out of business, and they do that. And and I won't go into how they manage the coordination, but Hire is also a leader in Internet of Things. They're working on immensely complex problems in healthcare and other industries where they're bringing all their expertise together. And I think they've created internally more new businesses than probably any other company on the planet. They've created 3 unicorns of their own. They've created dozens of gazelles. They've launched more than 4,000 startups internally. And it's very easy there to get something new started. So again, you know, when you see it's possible to have all the benefits of scale and size and control and consistency and the benefits of entrepreneurship and innovation, there really isn't any longer any excuse for any other organization not to say, all right, we need to go back to basics. We need to rethink the foundations of how we lead, manage, and organize. Because if we don't, we are going to get beaten by companies who've learned how to turn on that entrepreneurial passion in every single human being.
I mean, Gary, listening to you, I think it also sounds as if in those organizations that you're describing, individuals have a lot of agency in their decision making, in the way they collaborate with each other. I guess one of my questions then, therefore, is what does this mean for our concepts of leadership? What type of leadership do we require in those organizations that you're describing?
It's a really good question, Svenja. You know, I haven't come to my own kind of really clear, I would say, conclusions around that, but let me give you a few impressions. First of all, I think in most organizations, the word leadership is, we're not, when we talk about leaders, we're not talking about leadership in the sense I would recognize it. We have, I think, hopelessly conflated in most organizations the idea of positional authority and power and leadership. So if you hear somebody talk, and I hear this every day, if you hear somebody talk about the leadership team, what do they mean by that? They do not mean every single person in the organization who is moving the company forward, doing something new, attracting followers and adding value. No. What they really mean is the leadership team. These are people at the top of the pyramid. And so, and I can tell you, first of all, most of them are not leaders. You know, they are simply people who are very good at playing that bureaucratic game. Let me give you a piece of data. We did a survey for Harvard Business Review, and one of the questions we asked was, how do people get ahead in your organization? 76% of the respondents said bureaucratic behaviors are the primary way you get ahead. We know there is no correlation. There's no correlation in leadership ranks between compensation and performance. None. And so we keep using, and here's what I think happened without making a long story of this. As I say, if you go back to the early 20th century, administrative skills were rare. How to do a budget, how to decompose work, how to manage a team. These were rare skills. By about 1970, those skills were completely codified. by Peter Drucker, among others. When Peter Drucker wrote his book, The Effective Executive, he uses the word manager more than 200 times, the word leader, I think 11 times. So at some point, business schools, consulting companies, we said, okay, we can no longer sell management development because management, that's just like kind of a commodity now. We know what it takes to be a good manager. So let's start to tell people we can turn them into leaders. Now, if you read Barbara Kellerman at Harvard, Jeff Effer at Stanford, there is no evidence that we know how to turn managers into leaders. No evidence. We have an entire leadership industry that has no evidence that it knows how to do this, right? And if it was medicine, you couldn't keep doing this because you have no evidence that it's efficacious. So what we did is we kind of started to pretend, and we have all these leadership competence models and so on and so on. And yet, my definition of leadership is very simple. It has nothing to do with positional authority. A leader is somebody who makes a catalytic contribution to collective accomplishment under difficult circumstances. That could be anybody at any level. But when you start to see organizations like Birdsorg that run with kind of two managers, or I look at the US steel company, Nucor, by far the most innovative, consistently profitable steel company in the world. It runs with a third the number of managers as its competitors. The average span of control at Nucor is a manager to 130 employees. Then you have to start to say, okay, what do we mean by leader anymore? But let's stop pretending that leadership is calibrated in any way whatsoever with rank. It's not. And the pyramid you find in most organizations is not a pyramid of leadership. It's kind of an administrative aristocracy. And it's a pyramid of increasing span of control, bigger budgets, and so on. And we already talked about, the behaviors that you have to develop to win there. But the point is, most of those bureaucratic behaviors do nothing to create value. And in fact, in many cases, they kind of destroy value. So what you find in the organization that we profile in the book, they've redesigned their organizational models, their management models, so no one is competing for the scarce resource of promotion. No one is competing for positional power, and everyone is competing to add more value. And I think, one of the reasons, if I just jump back to Sven, your earlier question, why has this persisted so long? And let me throw up one other thing. One of the reasons it's persisted so long is that the I don't know if you can see that, but is the costs of bureaucracy are invisible in most organizations. We may say, okay, we have maybe a few too many layers, but when you have that kind of authoritarian, rule-driven kind of organization, the costs in terms of apathy, conformance, insularity, the poisonous politicking, none of that shows up on the P&L. And so one of the first things, and we talk about this in our book, one of the first things, if you want to get serious about this, you have to start to track these costs in your organization. And so we developed a little something called the Bureaucratic Mass Index. And anybody can go take this. It's free. If you go to humanocracy.com/BMI, it's free. You can take it, use it any way you want. But if you think about it, 20 years ago, very few companies reported on their environmental impact. They didn't report on diversity. Now most do. And I think, we need to hold leaders at every level accountable for reducing the bureaucratic drag in their own organizations. But I think, we're going to have to step back and really think hard about what we mean by that word leader, because the way it's used 90% of the time in business schools, consulting companies, and companies themselves, they're not talking about leadership.
Gary, you're making a very compelling and incredibly passionate appeal to all of us. So I guess a lot of people are asking themselves, where do I start? I'm not the CEO of where I work. How do I move my organization towards this? Because I want to be part of this new way of working.
So
what's your advice?
In the very short time we have, let me try to give a few very quick hints. The first thing is, I think, Sven, it starts with mindsets, and I know it sounds kind of wishy, like, oh, well, that's not really. But let me go back for a moment, to what I was talking about before, and why is it, despite the fact that we all know our organizations have these disabilities, right? We talk about how to create more resilient, more agile. And in fact, I got very interested, like, if you look at all the organizational innovation over the last 60 years, and I'm now kind of old enough, if I don't remember all of it, I knew the people who, the Chris Argyses and Ed Schein and Eric Trist and so on. And you go like, okay, so we did high performance work teams, we did T groups, we did total quality management, and now we're doing agile and mindfulness training. Why has so little of that made a difference? And if I can, again, let me just throw up something very quickly. Within a field of knowledge, like management, over time, you develop a kind of knowledge structure that has these elements to it. At the top, there are these fundamental paradigmatic beliefs we have, right? Why do we have organizations? What purpose do they fulfill in society? What's the relationship between organizations and individuals? So we have these deep paradigmatic beliefs, which we hardly ever challenge until we're forced to. Those beliefs point you towards certain problems and away from other problems. So let me give you an example. In the 17th century, philosophers like John Locke began to think about the sovereignty of the individual, not the sovereignty of the state, the monarch, the party, the sovereignty of the individual. And that led them to a new problem called self-government, which ultimately took root in democracy. But you have to change your fundamental belief, right? Is it the monarch who rules through the divine will of God, or is it the rule of individuals? And then that points you to certain problems. Those problems then point you to certain principles that are going to be useful in solving those problems. So in the case of democracy, that was one person, one vote, elective legislation, neutrality before the law, freedom of religion. Those principles then get translated into processes, practices, and then they drive the performance of a polity, a country. Now, the same thing is true in management. So if you go back, probably the deepest belief in management of all, the kind of most fundamental belief, was that human beings are resources. And we talk that way. We talk about human resources, human capital, which I think is quite awful. But the idea was the institution hires the individual to produce products, services, and ultimately, to produce an income. So in that way of thinking, the individual is an instrument. And if you think about your own life, if you've ever been in a relationship where you were primarily seen as an instrument, I'm pretty sure that wasn't a good relationship. And so if you ask yourself, why is it that only 15% of people around the world are truly engaged in their work? Why is it that only 1 out of 5 employees around the world believes their ideas matter at work? Why is it that only 1 in 11 believes they're free to experiment? All of that comes back to this fundamental. You are a resource. You are a factor of production. Please just do as you're told. And it's built into our language, our way of thinking. And the alternative says, no. Human beings are agents. And we join institutions because they allow us to do together what we couldn't do independently. But it's the institution that's the instrument, not the human being. And by the way, every person under 30 years old, this is how they think when they join an organization. And if they jump from organization to organization, it's only because they can't find the organization that feels like this. So when I first met Zhang Rumin from Hire, maybe 11 years ago, he was visiting me in my office in California. I'll never, the first thing he said to me, Sven, was this. He said, we're going to encourage our employees to become entrepreneurs because people are not a means to an end. They're an end in themselves. And our goal is to let everyone become their own CEO. Never before had I heard a CEO quote Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative that human beings are end, not a means. Because no HR person I know thinks that way. But if you want to unleash the imagination, the initiative, the passion of people, this is the only place you can start. And so I think the first thing you kind of have to come back and do is say, okay, let's rethink that fundamental paradigmatic belief. Then you start to say, okay, we need to also shift the problem. The problem of bureaucracy was, how do you maximize compliance? Now we have to say, how do you maximize contribution? We want you to bring all those amazing gifts to work. And then, in bureaucracy, you add a set of principles which are deeply baked into every system and process. In humanocracy, it's a different set of principles that you're trying to build into the organization. So if you go back to that question, why all of this management innovation, why did it make much of a difference? Because we keep coming in and we start with process or practice. And even when we go look at these like amazing, when you go look at a Birdsorg or a hire, I've seen this again and again, Sven, and I've seen it, back through the decades when people came and looked at Gore, when they looked at Svenska Handelsbank, when they looked at all these pioneering companies, executives would come in, but what they always wanted to know was what you do. They never asked, how do you think? And so they would borrow some little practice, compensation, performance review. They would borrow that practice, they'd take it back to their organization, try to graft it onto that old rootstock, and then they'd wonder why it, if I go back, it's like putting a tutu on a dog and hoping it's going to become a ballerina, right? You just end up with a stupid looking dog. So I think, I think the first thing is there. You have to change that mindset, and then you have to be alert to where is that old bureaucratic, how does that show up every day at work? Now, practically beyond that, what do you do as an individual? I would say three things. First, be aware of yourself when you're acting out of that old bureaucratic frame. Be aware when you're exhibiting those bureaucratic behaviors, when you're fudging a budget, when you're ignoring the human costs of a decision, when you're elbowing a rival out of the way for a promotion, when you're sucking up to your boss because that's easier than telling them that they're wrong, when you acquiesce in the face of a stupid policy rather than changing it. And in our book, we lay out, I think, a dozen of these kind of prototypical bureaucratic behaviors. Every week, do an inventory. When did I find myself? And then go to your team and say, when you see me behaving in this way, will you call me on it? Will you challenge me on it? Because it's easy to think of bureaucracy as something out there, but it's not. It's something in here. So that's number one. I would say number two, start to make a conscious effort to give whatever power you have away. And again, I think in the book we have like more than 20 little things you can do. Send one of your subordinates, terrible word, but send one of your team members to a meeting in your place where they're expecting you to show up as a seat. Send a more junior person and let them learn and let them grow into a bigger job. Invest in cross training. Make sure everyone on your team, invest in their business and their financial literacy so they're capable of making bigger decisions. We tell a wonderful story in the book about Michelin, more than 100 years old, which has done that. They've dramatically given authority away, pushed it down to the front lines, and everybody's job got better. So, make that conscious decision to give the people around you more scope, more permission, give them more challenging things to do so that they can grow. I think the last thing, which is perhaps the toughest, but in the end, very necessary, is you have to start to hack the old management model. Now, I don't think we are going to uninstall bureaucracy and build something better in its place top down, right? Even the consultants will tell you that only 1 in 4 typical change programs works, right? I mean, change management is an entire oxymoron, right? Change management is like saying virtual presence or a man bun or Scottish cuisine, right? It's not something that actually exists. But we want to have this illusion that somehow we can get a bunch of smart people together, script all the change at the top, roll it out, and then somehow. But I think in terms of reinventing management, I take my inspiration much more from open innovation. And how do you go out to the entire organization and engage them in this work and give them the permission to start to think about this? And I'll give you just one little example, if I can do this, of that might be helpful of something we did for Adidas here in North America. So for years, Adidas, you would probably say, Adidas in North America had underperformed Nike. They were losing market share and shelf space and so on. And the CEO said, like, how do we get rid of bureaucracy and how do we build a pro-innovation organization? So what we did there, and we've done this in different ways since, is, we started by teaching people. We took all these principles. How do you create How do you create an entrepreneurial culture? How do you encourage people to be more curious? How do you become more open to the environment around you? So each week this is completely voluntary. We invited a few thousand people. I think they had 3,000 employees come, and each week we kind of introduce a new kind of pro-humanocracy principle, and then we say, if we took this principle seriously, what will we change? So we're inviting the entire organization to hack the old model, and so we got hundreds, thousands of these kind of hacks, and then you go and then you evaluate them through peer review. Well, which of these makes sense? Which of these will make an impact? The ones that are best, we ask people then to develop those into an actual experiment. How would we go test this? We're not going to blow anything up, but how would we go test this? And then in turn, we took the best of those, brought people together, refined them into real experiments you could run. I'll just give you one example. So one individual, one team said, we really should have something internally like crowdfunding. An idea should not have to go up the chain of command to get funded, because our leaders have their emotional equity invested in the old model. They're not necessarily going to see the new opportunity. They're not the best ones to make resource allocations. Now, I can tell you, if you start with that idea, if you go to your CFO or somebody else and say, we want to create an internal Kickstarter, we want to change the way we make funding decisions, that would take you years. I mean, you'll probably fail, but that would be a very hard thing to get somebody to give you permission to do that. So instead, you do a little hack. And this was the simplest kind of lo-fi hack. This was done in a team, I think, of about 60 people. The leader of that team gave everybody $150 for this little experiment. And nothing high tech. They took a big white wall. And they said, if you have an idea that's not in our strategy, in our plan, you think it's a good one, here's a little template, share your idea. And now all of your peers can come and offer comments, and then they can also make funding decisions. Will they put some of their money behind this? Well, this was a 4-week experiment, and 10 pretty clever ideas went up, 5 got funded. And so with that little experiment, 30 days, almost no risk, no money, you could validate the hypotheses that there's a lot of cool ideas out there. They're not in the plan. The crowd can make smart decisions around these. But I think Svenja, this is how, the way you change something that's complex is not by some top-down design. It's through experimentation, right? If when Jeff Bezos was building Amazon, he said, I want to build the world's biggest laboratory. So the reason Amazon has evolved, they are just experimenting all of the time. And I think that's the same challenge in management. It's not, and if you go back and you look at Hire and you look at Birdsorg and you look at these other companies, they didn't have some like grand plan for how they were going to reinvent management. They had a few principles that they held to, and then just year after year after year, the question is, well, what else can we try? Let's experiment. Let's see if this works. The things that work, you then ramp them up. But I would say this as a final point. I believe that the most successful change programs in the future will be socially constructed. And one of Gary's personal dreams is that someday we will never again use the word cascade when we talk about change, because it's bullshit. It simply does not work. Not if you're trying to do something new. It's impossible. So I think, so wherever you are in an organization, you don't have to wait for permission to hack. You can start right where you are within your team. I think we need to be more open. We need to be more meritocratic. We need to be faster, whatever it is. What's getting in the way? Think about that. Design a little hack. Don't blow anything up. And I can tell you, there's such a hunger in most organizations that if you hack something and you get a good result, people are going to notice. They're going to say, hey, how do we do that too? So, I think it's so easy in an organization to have this learned helplessness, where it's like, well, if it's, I got to wait for HR, I got to wait for our CTO or IT. No, you do not have to wait, right? All of us have a choice. You can bitch or you can hack, but that's your choice.
I mean, so many great nuggets in there, Gary, really. And I think what struck me was this: ask someone to call you out when you find when they notice you're getting back to the old ways in a way. This community, you need those friends of learning, those friends of the change, and those allies to really help you along. Gary, I mean, what have been some of the challenges, I guess, you've seen? Because there will be resistance, right? And have you seen any of this? And can you say something about how to best stay with it, even in the face of resistance?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. A book that was quite influential for me, Svenja, that got me thinking about this was a book written by Art Kleiner some years ago, probably 20 years ago, and it was called The Age of Heretics. And it was a story of all these early management pioneers like Douglas McGregor and Mary Parker Follett and others who had these amazing ideas for how to change organizations. And the question, and often ran these unbelievable experiments with great results, but almost none of that stuck. It didn't last. And you saw these experiments at Volvo and a whole lot of companies. And what Art concluded at the end of all this was the reason they didn't last is because the empire struck back. Right? In the end, it was just too uncomfortable, because what is my role as a manager in an organization where the work of managing is distributed to the periphery? Right? What is my work as a leader when I am no longer the chief strategist, when strategies get created out of an open kind of conversation? So I think, there's several implications to that. One is you have to help administrators and kind of the bureaucratic class. And I don't mean to say that in a derogatory way, but that they have to believe there's a future here for them as well. And what you find, and what we found at Hire, what you found at Michelin, is that managers are also not having a very good time. In fact, the Gallup data on engagement shows that managers are even less engaged than their employees, because what they're being asked to do every day is to be a surrogate parent to adults, right? To show up and micromanage adults. Like when you're a parent, the happiest thing is when your kids start making good decisions for themselves, and you release some of those constraints. And so what you find is that those leaders can start, either they go back into technical careers that they probably enjoy more than being a manager, or if they're just kind of a natural leader, they will end up in entrepreneurial roles. They'll still be leaders because they know how to motivate and attract people. But you will have taken away most of that, most of the compliance, most of the problem solving. And what we find is that when you give people mission, when you train them, those people on the front lines can solve much bigger, tougher problems than we ever thought. And so everybody's job gets better. I can work on more interesting problems myself. I can be a mentor. I can, work on other issues. And in any organization, there's no shortage of interesting problems to solve. It's not as if, there's no other work for those very smart, clever people who are right now in those administrative roles to do. There is other vital work for them to do. Having said that, the transition personally is not always that easy, right? Kind of giving up and moving into a new role. So you have to support and you have to help people through that. Otherwise, they can kind of be a force for resistance. One of the things that helps that along is when you crowdsource the problem. Because when you have hundreds or thousands of people developing hacks or saying this part of our bureaucratic model doesn't work, it's very hard for anybody to stand in the way. One thing that struck me when Pope Francis, when he became Pope, I think it was 2013, early on in his papacy, he described the Vatican bureaucracy as leprosy. I don't use that kind of intemperate language, but maybe the Pope can get away with that. But he said this is a leprosy, and we need to be more responsive as a church to the needs of people around the world. And he said, we're going to change this. Well, somebody last year asked him, how's it going? How's this you're the Pope? How is it going as you're trying to reduce bureaucracy? He said, I feel like I'm trying to clean the Sphinx with a toothbrush. And this is, I think, the experience a lot of CEOs have today. They know the problem is not the operating model. They know it's the man. We're too slow, too many layers. And yet they are quite powerless to change it themselves, because they're working down through these layers of relatively complacent people who grew up in the old model. They're happy with it. Well, my advice to Pope Francis is you got to get more toothbrushes, right? You got to push this problem down. You have to have hundreds, thousands of people working on this. And that kind of pressurizes the system a bit from below. So I would say that, the biggest problem is it's uncomfortable, right? It's a big change. And the way you deal with that is you help people understand everybody's going to have more fun. This is a win for everybody. But you also have to pressurize the system a little bit in the process, I think, sometimes to unlock and get things started.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, have you seen any, or in your mind, are there companies that are better suited to humanocracy than others? Or would you say there is no distinction? Everyone,
it's interesting. I've seen it, in financial services, in healthcare, in manufacturing, in the public sector, India, China, Brazil. It seems, human beings are more alike than different around the world. And when you build organizations where people can succeed and win and bring that capability to work, I think one of the things that for me, Sven, is that, the reason that I am passionate about this is not because I see this primarily as a competitive challenge. It is. I think it's going to be hard to compete and win unless you have this sort of deeply entrepreneurial organization. But I will tell you two other reasons to care about this. One is economic. We talked a little bit about that. If I was any policymaker across Europe right now, and I'm asking myself, how do we reduce structural unemployment? How do we make sure we're capturing the value of these new technologies in the future? I'm going to put enormous amount of attention thinking about how do I unlock this kind of management innovation across an economy. And I'd be looking to business schools and investors and unions and CEOs and saying, this is a national priority, because if we don't get this right, we are going to be stuck, and we'll have a declining share of global GDP and so on, and more social pressures and so on. So for me, it's definitely an economic challenge, but it's also a social challenge. The thing that one of the amazing statistics for me, and you guys have seen this, I'm sure, those who are participating today, is around the world, capitalism is under threat. A big global survey, and I think this was Edelman, and it was more than 20 countries. And maybe I'll bring up the data, maybe I won't bother. But they asked people around the world, does capitalism do more harm than good? And like, the amazing thing is, when you ask that question across all these different countries, in most countries, people think that capitalism is doing more harm than good. I will tell you, it is capitalism, not socialism, that brought 2 billion people out of poverty over the last 40 years. Now, that, by the way, there are things in capitalism that need to change. We have too much concentrated power, CEO compensation problem, all kinds of things we have to change here. I'm not saying this is perfect by any means. But what I would argue is the fundamental problem with capitalism is we don't have enough capitalists. Right? When I go to a company like Hire, every single employee there thinks, I have the chance to create the future. I have the chance to succeed. I have the chance to grow. And it kind of drives me crazy, Sonia. I hear CEOs and policymakers talk about low-skilled jobs. That's bullshit. There's no job. That is bureaucratic privilege speaking. That is credentialism speaking. There's no job in the world, janitor, anything else, that is inherently low skill. But what do you find in so many organizations? We've not trained those people to think like business thinkers. We don't give them any financial upside. We don't give them permission to experiment and innovate. And then we say, oh, you're in a low-skilled job.
Gary, time flies when you're having fun. And it pains me to interrupt you there, Gary. Thank you so much for your passion, for your time. Thank you for joining us at INSEAD today. Thanks to all of our community who've joined us. Do stay in touch. There's many exciting webinars coming up. Gary, once again, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
So for those of you who want to keep up the connection with us, there's exciting webinars coming up. And can we ask you to please fill in the Qualtrics questionnaire that we'll be sending you after this webinar. Thank you so much for your time once again, Gary, and thanks to all of you for joining us today.